Hey everyone, welcome to another CG Cookie live stream. Today we're talking about RetopoFlow, which is a Retopology add-on for Blender. And I've got two special guests with me, developers Jonathan Williamson and Jon Denning.
How we doing, folks?
Hello.
That'd be Jonathan Williamson, and here's Dr. Denning in
Hello.
his office. Where are you at right now?
I'm currently in my office. I teach at a university, so this is my university office.
Nice. And we can't see Jonathan Williamson quite yet, but he'll be joining us pretty soon. But he's here in audio form and in spirit.
I may or may not be having some technical issues. Still resolving them.
Yeah. And let us know how the audio goes. It was kind of funky earlier, so if it's way off for one person, please let me know, and I'll try to fix it pretty quick. But first things first, let's talk about RetopoFlow. For anybody who's not necessarily familiar with what that is, or maybe they've heard about it and they know that it's about Retopology, Dr. Denning, can you explain what it is exactly?
Sure. Yeah, the RetopoFlow is a tool that is designed to help artists retopologize a three-dimensional surface. So if you digital sculpting is really useful for being able to very quickly create forms and silhouettes and just kind of nail down what you're kind of going for. The problem is the topology of it, so the way that all the triangles and n-gons and quads and everything, all the edges connect up, is not really good for any other part of the production pipeline, like texturing and animation and rigging and so on. So artists will go back through and recreate the surface with nicer topology, something that has nice edge flow. And this tool steps in to try to help make that process a whole lot easier and hopefully a little bit more enjoyable.
Yeah, if any of you guys have done Retopology before, you know that it's kind of a technical process. It's very slow and kind of tedious. So any tool that helps speed that up and make it more artist-friendly and kind of fun is definitely welcome and makes it a lot better. So there's like a set of tools. It's not just one tool. It's actually an entire mode basically inside of Blender that once you install the add-on, then you get access to these different tools and you can very quickly go through them. So I can do like a basic demonstration of what the tools are right off the bat, and then we can get into the difference of the new version, RetopoFlow 3.0 versus 2.0, and what's different and changed, and how that like update process went, because there's a lot going on under the hood that might not be obvious just right on the surface, and I think that'd be kind of fun to dig into a little bit. So first, let me pull up Blender here, and I have a sculpt here from Kent Trammell that's pretty old. I dug deep into the archives to find this creature sculpt, but it's a really fun one, and it's also a good example of retopologizing a sculpt. So it's pretty dense. If I zoom in pretty close, you can see that the triangles are very small. I don't have wireframe mode or anything inside of RetopoFlow, but you can see that it's a pretty dense sculpt. And there's a couple different tools that we can use to quickly rough out some shapes for this. And the first tool is contours, and this is mainly used for like limbs, arms, tentacles, things like that are like very cylindrical. And so if we have our little tail here, then all we need to do is control, click, and drag across it, and that's going to create loops just like that. So super fast, and we can also change the number of segments if we want, just by shift and scrolling up and down, and then any loop that we create after that, once we have this loop selected, is going to just automatically attach right there. So it's very, very quick for any kind of limb or tentacle. I don't know, what else have you seen it used on, John or Jonathan?
Yeah, mostly just cylindrical objects. You can also use it on the torso, so at the line of symmetry, and it will wrap or up to that line.
Oh, like this. Okay.
Although be aware that just like any other mirror modifier or any other symmetrical tool, it does rely on the symmetry point being directly in the center. So looks like the creature sculpt is a little offset, but that's all right for demonstration.
Yeah, I think that's my origin point is a little bit off here, but otherwise, yeah, it does wrap around quite nicely.
And one thing that John was starting to say that's really cool and this actually was introduced in 2.0, I believe, John, is that we can now do basically half loops with contours. And so if you go across the torso or something like that with symmetry enabled, then it'll still work.
Nice. So it doesn't
and
try
so
to...
any cylindrical form, whether it's a full torso, arm, leg, tentacle, you name it, is ideal for contours.
That's really cool. And one thing that I found when I was kind of experimenting with this earlier is that it worked in cases that I actually expected it to break, which was really cool. For example, there's this little horn thing, bone protrusion, I don't know what this is, sticking out of the creature. And it has part of his back and spine behind it. But even if I create a little cut that overlaps with that back area, you would expect it to not work, or at least try to incorporate some of the stuff that's behind the bone. Oops. And you have to deselect everything else, otherwise it's going to try to connect. So if I deselect and then zoom into this area where any other tool in Blender would totally not work, it actually works great. And with the surface snapping and all that stuff, you can select the edge loop and just move it back and forth, and it's not going to try to snap to the surface behind it. So John, can you explain a little bit what's going on there that allows that to work?
So most of the tools actually work in screen space. So when you're drawing that line for creating a new cut, there'll be a little circle that is basically you telling where contours needs to start.
Okay.
And then we have some pretty robust, at least I'm hoping so at this point, robust algorithms for being able to walk over the surface. So there can be some problems where if you have some edges or polygons that are next to each other, but they're not actually connected, you're not sharing an edge, so you have some non-manifold edges. Contours may hit that point and kind of stop. It handles it pretty gracefully, but as long as the surface is complete, it's closed. Well, it doesn't even have to be closed, but at least where you're working, it can walk all over that surface and do a pretty decent job.
That's super cool.
So sorry. So a lot of the tools work in screen space mode. The nice thing is what you see is pretty close to what you get. Okay. And that's what we're trying to kind of aim for. So same thing with polystrips. If you sketch out we'll get to that, but if you sketch out a strip, basically whatever you see up on your screen is what it produces.
Nice. Yeah, that's a good time to go down to the next tool, which is polystrips. And this one is just fun to use, really. Because all you're doing is just drawing on the object and just control left click and drag, and you got yourself a little strip of polygons. But it's so cool that you can adjust it after the fact with these Bezier type handles. And and you can easily change the poly count and all that stuff, or select a face and just kind of draw something out from that. So super quick, just polygon sketching, I guess. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I really appreciate with these handles here is that it works on an arbitrary selection. So it doesn't have to be the stroke that you just made. I can just select these and adjust it like that. Whatever. So that's super cool. Is that relatively new, or was that always in there?
That was something that was one of the major changes from version 1 to version 2. In version 1, polystrips was its own tool, and it kept track of what you had sketched out, so it made some things really easy, but other things, like if you were wanting to start up a new session from a previous version or a previous retopologized mesh, it didn't have that information, that history anymore. So when we were developing 2.0, that was one thing that we really worked on, was trying not to have it remember anything and only using what is selected as being the basis for working.
Nice, and that makes it a lot more flexible.
Yes. Yeah.
So by the way, I believe I'm mostly done with technical issues, so
okay, cool.
It should be working now. If my audio is funky, just let me know. I have tried to somewhat seamlessly switch between mics and headsets in the background.
Okay, let me know when you think you got video and I can switch over.
I've got video. Oh, wait, almost.
Okay, no rush. In the meantime, I've
got video.
Oh, cool. And hey, there you are. Or there's Kent's sculpt. Unless that's what you look like now. You might have been working out a bunch.
I've been working out a lot.
You need some sun, though.
Yes. I look like one of the Prometheans right now. Alrighty. Yeah, so I can pick up wherever you guys left off on the demo side, or if you want to just...
yeah, go for it.
So I think you were just talking about polystrips, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the things that, not to change subjects too much, but since I was dealing with the technical side, I may have not been paying as close attention to the conversation as I should have been. One of the things that I would like to try and do during this stream, and we can kind of do it intermixed and do a little here, do a little there, is actually walk through some of the actual process that's involved. You know, I know in past RetopoFlow live streams, oftentimes we've gone over a lot of the individual tools, but we never really gone through too much of the actual retopology process using all of the different tools at once. So this might be a good example to do that.
Sounds fun.
And so one of the things that I wanted to do, I'm just going to go in here on the face here, is I always like to use the face as an example for retopology projects, just because it's so complicated. There's so many different topology flows that you need to work with, and it makes basically a great stress case for all the different tools. So just to give you a little example, let's say that we want to retopologize the eyes here. There's a whole slew of different ways we can do it, and at this point RetopoFlow has gotten advanced enough that you can kind of cater it to whatever your preference is. You know, if you want to just work from the eyes out, going one polygon at a time, you can. If you want to try and work in large sections, you can. So just to give you a couple of quick examples, is if we're using polystrips, we can just work on a little section at a time, maybe adjust the segment count, and at any point in time, typically with any of the tools, you can not only adjust the size, but also the number of segments that get added in. So for example, when we're working with polystrips, the segments refer to how many faces do we have to make up that strip. And anytime after the fact, we can go in and adjust those so that we can kind of fine tune the entire process. Then we'll just kind of go right up here. So polystrips is always a good tool for basically laying out sections, or anywhere that you literally have just a strip of quads. And it can be used for blocking out sections, or it can be really detailed. So for example, like if we want to just lay a strip of quads across the torso here, we can just do something like that. And you'll notice everything, correct me if I'm wrong here, John, when we first draw, it's all done in screen space. In other words, it's effectively 2D. We're just basically doing a 2D projection from what you see onto the mesh. So if you, for example, draw across, say, like the edge of the torso like this, you'll start to see that you start getting some shearing in the faces. Whereas if you just draw across the areas that are a lot flatter relative to the view, you'll tend to get more consistent results. And this is something that we've done. We didn't actually used to do this, John, did we? Didn't it used to actually be all 3D?
Right. It used to be all 3D. We ran into some problems with, for very thin surfaces, sometimes it would snap to the opposite side of the source. And so this was one way to be able to sort of remedy that. However, I do have some ideas on ways to actually improve, preventing the skewing on the side. I just haven't had time to implement that yet.
So, polystrips is really good for that type of thing. You can very easily draw cross surfaces. You can extend from an existing face. It doesn't actually even have to be selected. You can go from any face like this. You can start to lay out kind of your map of your topology. If you ever need to go in and say scale a segment, you can do that at either end. And basically what you'll notice is that polystrips is just designed to be basically allow you to control strips of polygons with a Bezier curve. So each one of these handles just acts like a Bezier curve, like you would anywhere else in Blender, whether you're working with animation handles, with actual curve objects, you name it. But every time that you select a series of faces, it recreates that curve. And so what's cool is that even if we exit RetopoFlow, we now have just real geometry here. I'm going to wireframe. So this is the geometry that was created. But if we go back into RetopoFlow, then we can go ahead and continue manipulating those strips with the curves. So simply going into Polystrips tool, right click and drag to select, and we've got curves. You'll notice that at each intersection of faces, it automatically detects that there's that intersection, and so we create an additional handle. So this just it gives you a lot of flexibility in how you lay things out. In the early versions of Polystrips, everything was permanent in that, like, you basically drew a strip, and then that strip was permanent up until the point that you left RetopoFlow, and then you couldn't do anything else with it. And that was really limiting, whereas now all of the handles are drawn on the fly. But let's say that we now want to start filling in this section here. This is where we start using things like Polypen. Polypen can be really powerful because it's basically the manual tool for drawing your geometry any way you want. So you just simply select an edge, hold down Control, and then left click, and we can have complete control of where we want our geometry to go. It's basically like a combination of extrude, the cut tool, and the knife tool all in one. So like in this case, I kind of underestimated how many edges I might need in this area to then actually go in and create the eyes. So I can simply Control click, inserts in the face, Control click, cut across that edge, and then I can keep going. My perspective depth is giving me a little trouble with the viewport, but and so where this starts becoming really powerful is where you have like complex intersections. So for example, right here, I have what's going to be called a pole, because I want to basically bring these edges in like this. So I can simply start clicking and dragging and filling in that geometry really quickly. And one of the most powerful parts of Polypen is that it has some selection prediction of sorts, such that every time you create a new face, it selects the adjacent edges that you are most likely to need. And so you never have to, for the most part, go in and reselect anything. You will notice that it's a little slow at times in terms of there's a lot of clicking involved, but what it does in exchange is it gives you absolute control over what you're actually creating. And so like you'll notice here, I've got this edge highlighted, and anywhere, if I hover over any one of these adjacent edges or vertices, it automatically fills it in with pre-selection highlighting just to show what we're going to create. And so, if we do something like this, and then we can grab that vertex, and then we can move it down, snap it down, or snap it to the vertex, and we can start filling in that area. I'm having depth issues. Get in there. And so this Polypen is probably the most powerful tool as far as your ability to create any flow you want. But one thing that you'll also start to find is, in some cases, you just want to work more quickly. So let's say instead of going really manual in that way, maybe we want to instead just fill in sections quickly by drawing strokes. And this is where the stroke tool can get really powerful. So the strokes tool is one that, John, I think we introduced this in version 2?
Yeah.
And where it allows us to do things is, let's say we've got this entire circle here, and normally if you were working in edit mode, what you might do is simply, actually let me just do this, Go into wireframe. You might hit extrude, you might scale it down, smooth it a few times, and then snap it to the surface underneath. But the problem here is that every single time that you do this, you have to go back in and sorry, I'm trying to get back into MatCap. Come on now. Every time that you do that, you have to either redistribute the vertices, you have to what? Why am I in circle select?
Good old hotkey changes.
Yeah. One thing I have to admit is I'm not actually very up to speed in the hotkey changes for 2.8, and so it's taken me the longest time to get reaccustomed to them. I've just been doing a lot more work behind the scenes, and so I haven't been nearly as active in Blender as I would like. But anyway, so every time that you would extrude, you have to basically redistribute those vertices, resnap them to the surface, and it'd be a lot nicer if you could just basically draw a profile, which is what strokes allows you to do. So like here, I have this circle selected, and I can just draw a circle around the eye in the profile that I want it to match, and it will then fill that in. And I can, at this point, I can increase the segments or decrease the segments to then start filling that. I can go over here, and let's say I want to fill this whole section by the ears. I could simply right-click and drag to select those, deselect that vertex, and I want it to go right up to this line right by the ear, and I can simply control-click and drag and fill that in. And
and that automatically snapped to all those vertices at the top? Ooh.
So since I had basically this selection done, and then I drew from a vertex that is actually connected by an edge span to my selection, it automatically fills it in. I can do the same thing if I want to, for example, fill this area here. Deselect those edges. I can just draw a stroke in the middle, and it'll extrude out to fill that. Then I can adjust the segments any way that I want. But at the same time, we could also go the other way. We can draw out like this, and it'll do the same thing, just depending on which profile you want to match. So, if you want to match this crazy curve, we can do that. Or if you want to match this crazy curve, you can do that. And so it gives you a lot of flexibility as far as where you're drawing to and from. Another example is we can select this whole area, and we want to fill this cheekbone. Well, if I were to just extrude this out one by one, basically I'd have to constantly be readapting the profile here for the cheeks, and instead I can just do something like this, and it'll fill that in. Or I can do it like this. That one doesn't work quite as well. But there's a lot of different ways that you can use the strokes to quickly fill a lot of different areas. Let's see. If I do, this one should work. There we go.
Oh,
so
cool.
Something like this worked really well, but you'll notice that now we have some distribution problems, in that these faces are really wide, but the actual edge flow may be what we want, in which case we simply switch over to the relax tool, which is just a brush. It acts a lot like a sculpting brush. It has 3 parameters: strength, size, and fall off. So for example, just like sculpting, you hit F, you can increase the size. Shift F, you can increase the strength as indicated by the opacity of the green, or Control F adjusts the fall off. And the inner circle there is basically the full strength, and then anything within the shaded area is just a blended fall off, so that you can get nice gradual results. So here with the relax brush, I can just start painting, maybe reduce my strength a little bit, and all of the vertices underneath my brush will basically try to make themselves square. Every now and then you'll find some funky results where, like, if you have a lot of complex quads with lots of poles, every now and then you may need to selectively highlight a few areas and to limit what's being affected. But particularly for larger areas, it works really well to just basically redistribute the quads and get you a pretty nice result. At the same time, you may notice that you may have some shifting that you didn't want within the vertices, and so you can just switch over to the tweak brush, and it has the same 3 parameters of size, fall off, and strength, and you can start just pushing things around in a really organic way that's super friendly for sculptors. It's also very tablet friendly, So anybody that wants to do retopology on a tablet will probably find the combination of relax, tweak, and then the strokes tool pretty smooth.
Really, all of these work very well with the tablet.
They really do.
Not true of most modeling tools.
No, and I think that was one of the. Well, I got a projection issue. That was one of our goals from day one. Was, John, we may have a symmetry bug with strokes. I'm not sure. One of our goals from day one was to try and make retopology a more organic process. Sculpting was always so good at bringing in more traditional artists into the fold, where you weren't just literally manually tweaking vertices bit by bit, and you could actually just work as if it were clay. But nobody really ever managed to do that for geometry nearly as much, and so that was kind of one of our goals here. There we go. We'll do something like that.
Nice. And one thing that I think shouldn't be understated either, that I don't think we really touched on, is just how clear the mesh is. Like, you can easily see what you're working on, what the surface is, what's underneath the surface or on the other side, where in Blender's just like default view, like there's a few tricks that you can do to make retopology look okay, but it's never going to be ideal. Like, it just looks funky, even if you use like in front or X-ray or those different options. There's always something weird about it.
Well, and that's one of the main reasons why RetopoFlow exists as a mode, is by having it exist as a mode where basically it hides the rest of Blender. We're able to do a lot more custom drawing. So all of the mesh visualization is all custom. So you'll notice that we've got backface culling such that you can't see through your surface geometry. Everything draws on top of the surface mesh. And I mean, John can probably elaborate on this, but getting that to draw well and consistent is really hard.
Very hard.
John, actually, maybe why don't you go ahead and talk a little bit about what goes into the custom drawing for RetopoFlow.
Right. So
and I'm just gonna
keep
going.
So drawing is really hard, especially in interactive graphics, like what we're doing here. Like what you see in a video game is actually really, really, really highly tuned graphics. The artists work very closely with the coders to make sure that everything is exactly how they want it, which means that from scene to scene, maybe even the parameters change. The problem is here we don't have a lot of that control, because meshes can be 30 meters, or they can be 2 centimeters large. So it's really hard, and even in the clipping. So there's a near clipping and a far clipping. I can't remember off the top of my head what Blender calls it, but so everything happens within there. If there's anything that's closer than the near, it doesn't get drawn. If there's anything farther than the far, it doesn't get drawn. But what those are set to can affect how things are drawn, especially in terms of what's in front of the other thing. And so it's really hard to get something to work in a general case that's satisfying to the artists. And so what we're doing, part of the reason why RetopoFlow is in its own mode is when you start up RetopoFlow, it will get the size of your meshes. It'll get how big it is, and it scales it down or up to fit in a very particularly sized box. And the reason why we do this is so that we have complete control over the size of the object. Now, whenever you leave RetopoFlow, it undoes that scaling. So from an artist's point of view, you shouldn't notice this happening at all. It just happens all under the hood. But it scales everything down. It also scales the near and far planes that I had mentioned, so that everything is a certain distance away, and we have a lot. We can make some better assumptions about it. And then it's just carefully tuning. When we're drawing the target like a quad on top of the source, we want to push it just ever so slightly toward the camera so that it's drawn on top of the source mesh. But when you have like really fine details, you don't want to see through the source mesh. You want to be able to see just what is exactly on top. So it's a really careful balancing act of settings to get it just right. And even then, it's not perfect. But it gets, for most cases that we have seen, it gets us 95% of the way there.
Yeah, I think a good example of this is right now the nose on his face, where that is not retopologized yet. And you can actually clearly see the nose of the sculpt, even if you're kind of looking at it from the side or whatever. Mm. Whereas even if you're working with this in Blender and everything's supposed to be drawn on top, the back faces of the other side of like the mirrored geometry would be like poking through his nose.
Right.
You wouldn't actually be able to see what you're drawing on.
Yeah, the X-ray mode, what it's actually doing is it'll draw the source or everything that's not X-ray. It draws everything, and then it clears out the information. It keeps the color information so you can still see the mesh, but it removes all the depth information, and then it redraws the other meshes all on top. So it doesn't even care about where the previous mesh was. It just draws on top of it, which is why you would see through. You would lose being able to see the tip of the nose because of the geometry. Like you had said, the mirrored geometry on the other side.
That sounds incredibly simple. Yeah, no, it's. I don't know, John. I feel like getting the drawing to work well, getting it to be performant, and for the results to be consistent such that you could at least manage expectations has probably been maybe the single hardest thing in this. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. It's been a hard problem to solve, mostly because add-ons are not, you can do this type of stuff in an add-on, but we're kind of pushing what we're allowed to what we're allowed to do within Blender to make it do exactly what we want it to do. So,
well, and frankly, there's awful lot of stuff that we're doing that has never really been designed for. In
right.
that, there's a lot. I mean, maybe John, maybe you can give a couple of examples, but like stuff that we're doing that it's not that it's disallowed per the developer guidelines or anything like that, but it was simply never accounted for as a expected use case.
Right. So most add-ons are expected. So the assumption is they are a quick operator that you hit a button like subdivide, it does the thing. Maybe there's some settings that you would want to regenerate the result, and then it gets out of the way. Or there is a way to be able to do a modal operator, which is it takes control temporarily, but it's always allowing Blender to kind of do its thing, but your add-on has kind of priority over all the other tools. So an example of this is the knife cut. When you hit K or whatever and you're clicking along, you're still in that knife mode. Every one of those clicks are going to the knife operator, and then it once you commit it, then control is relinquished back to Blender. Whereas here we're wanting to have these specific tools that we have complete control over, and it may be several hours that we're controlling Blender, not just for a few seconds while we click a couple of waypoints for the knife. We want to be able to take complete control over it, be able to manipulate the mesh as we want and render it as we want. So, yeah.
Well, and one of the things that has resulted in that, at least for me, was definitely kind of an unforeseen consequence as far as like the type of work that we would have to do. But you'll notice, if I bring up our delete and dissolve menu, this basically mirrors Blender's delete and dissolve, but it's all custom, because the longer that people spend in the RetopoFlow mode doing all sorts of custom actions, the more they're wanting to tweak the geometry in the way that they're most comfortable, which is typically using a lot of Blender's default tools. Well, we don't have access to a lot of Blender's default tools because of all the custom drawing that we need to do in order to make it actually look good and feel good when you're using, just like Lampel was mentioning earlier with the all of the custom drawing and the visibility that you can actually see what you're working on in RetopoFlow. Just as a quick example, if I exit here and we go back to edit mode, from a distance it looks all right, but as soon as I start getting closer and closer, your mesh visibility just goes to crap. You just can't hardly see what you're working on, in part because every little area that we're working on here, take the pectorials for a moment, because our underlying geometry is much denser, it also has a much more gradual profile. Well, we're working with a lower resolution mesh, and so by its very nature and intentionally, it's blockier. So all of our nice new surfaces keep getting occluded by the high res surface, and the only real way to fix that natively in Blender is to either turn on some combination of X-ray or to use something like the shrink wrap modifier, which works for a lot of cases, but starts becoming really problematic when you start working in tight areas, such as around a figure's armpits or around the neckline. Shrink wrap just becomes exponentially worse the more complicated your model is. And so you want your geometry to be snapping to the nearest surface point or being projected onto the surface point, and to have all of that snapping basically be messed up just so you can see your mesh is really annoying.
And sometimes I've found that the native snapping tools kind of fight with shrink wrap and stuff a little bit. Like they don't always work together in a clean way. So you kind of sometimes have to use one or the other, disable shrink wrap or apply it, and then use your snapping and then turn it back on or turn off snapping for a bit. And it can be a bit of a hassle.
Right. Yeah. One thing to keep in mind is most of the things in Blender are designed to be kind of by themselves. They work really well solving one particular problem. Some of them work pretty well together. They're designed as kind of like a package, but they're really just kind of independent tools working separately. And the visualization all has to be general to be able to handle all sorts of different things. It works fine in the general case, but when you start getting these very specific things like what you were saying, the armpit, combining shrink wrap with these other snapping tools, it just doesn't quite work. And so one thing that we've been really working toward is making sure that all the tools work well together. The visualization's really helpful for retopologizing. It may not be great for other things, but that's not the point. The point is to make it useful for retopologizing.
Yeah. I think, so we have a couple questions here, if you guys are going to answer some. First is by Omar. He said, have you ever done a RetopoFlow race?
No, I can't say we have.
Could be something to consider in the future.
It'd be fun.
Another question is, will this ever get integrated into Blender, either as its own tool, or let me find that question exactly. Any chance this gets integrated into Blender proper in the future as a standard add-on / extra mode? From Peter.
I'll take a stab at answering this because it's actually probably a far more complicated question than maybe most of us typically consider. In short, yes. In long, no. And what I mean by that is there's an awful lot of underlying development that we've done for RetopoFlow, such as the mesh visualization, the surface snapping, things like that are basically core functionality that has nothing to do with the actual tool functionality and the tool workflow. The way that the meshes are drawn and the way that surfaces are snapped to doesn't directly impact, for example, the workflow of something like contours or polystrips. That underlying technology is what we would love to see integrated into Blender by default. We'd love to see Blender handling all of the mesh visualization, doing all of the heavy lifting, for one, because then it would all be done in C. It'd be probably dramatically faster, and it would allow us as the RetopoFlow developers to just focus on the tool workflow, improving the actual tools themselves instead of having to write a lot of the underlying systems. As far as the add-on itself getting included, my hunch says no. And the reason being is this. The moment that something gets added into Blender by default, one of two things has to happen. Either the developers have to commit to maintaining it so that every single Blender release that goes out, bug fixes are happening for that version to make sure that it just continues to work for everybody in all versions of Blender, which is great. That's exactly what should happen. But for something like RetopoFlow, the amount of development that's involved at its current state is far too high for that to be a ongoing volunteer basis, frankly. Because it's literally hundreds and thousands of hours of work that goes into it, not just for maintenance, but for ongoing development. And so, unfortunately, the reality is that unless RetopoFlow is being sold, there's not the intrinsic motivation to maintain it because it's a large code base. It's much larger than I think we would prefer it to be because, again, of all the underlying functionality that we have had to do custom that goes beyond what Blender can do by default. And so the reason I probably wouldn't put the add-on directly into core, or not into core, into master, is that would probably be dooming it to die. Because it's simply a little too difficult to maintain in its current state. And if we're not maintaining it, I can't promise that anybody else will maintain it. And if we're not continuing to sell it, frankly, we don't have the resources to maintain it. But we'd love to offload much of the heavy lifting and get that into core. And even if it's us doing a lot of that work ourselves to get it into master, if that's working directly with the Blender development team, all ears there. But it's a complicated issue.
Yeah, I remember there was a add-on. I forgot exactly what it was called, but it had something to do with drawing on the mesh. Do you remember? Was it B surfaces?
B surfaces?
Yeah.
Yeah, probably B surfaces.
Yeah, and that as soon as it came into Blender and you could just enable it as an add-on, it basically stopped being developed and shortly didn't really work all that well.
Yeah, well, and one of the problems that happens is unless it's like crucial core functionality that applies to basically everybody that's modeling in Blender, if it's being developed or if it's being included in master by default for everybody, chances are you're not going to see any additional feature development. You're mostly going to see just maintenance and bug fixes, which is fine, but it also means that in an industry like modeling and such, everything moves so quickly that if a tool's not continuously updated, well, then it's outdated in a year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever it ends up being, and then it just withers and dies.
Yeah. There's, I guess, not an entirely related question, but the next one that is sort of tangential. When working with RetopoFlow, I often miss the ability to move individual vertices in all available tools. Is that something that could be developed more, or is that hard to implement?
I'll let John elaborate after on this. I'll first just say that we're definitely trying to get the ability to have access to basically all the core transform tools, grab, rotate, scale, etc., in all the tools as able. Some of them are a little trickier than others due to the selection requirements and or what's being involved.
Right. So a lot of the like for example in contours, the grab and rotate are very specific to contours. So if you have a loop selected and you hit G, it's going to try to shift or move that loop along the cylinder that you are that it's attached to. It's not going to behave the same way as grab would if you're just in plain edit mode. Now, as kind of a workaround, it's not really convenient, but you could always, from whatever tool you're currently in, switch to polypen, and then do the operation, and then move back. The problem is if you have vertices that are on the back side, like that leg example like you had right there. Right.
There we go.
Then it because the tools work in screen space, it's going to try to put it on geometry that it sees, on the source that it sees. So So it's not a perfect solution. So this is exactly why actually Contours has its own specific way of handling grab, is because you're often working on parts of the geometry that you can't actually see. In this case right here, you're only seeing half of the vertices. The rest of them are being occluded by the backside of the leg or the inside of the leg. So
this is also an example of how, if you were working with default tools using, say, a combination of surface snap and shrink wrap, this is where that kind of stuff gets really difficult, because most surface snapping tools, including some of RetopoFlow's, like John said with PolyPen, happen in screen space where you're basically drawing it in 2D and then projecting it onto the surface. That doesn't work when you're trying to deal with cylindrical forms. So, I guess to go back to the original question, one of the things that we are trying to do is to basically enable you to work as if you have access to all of the individual transforms natively. So, if you hit grab in Contours, you're grabbing your loop and you are sliding it along the surface. If you hit grab in PolyPen, you are just transforming your selection just like any other geometry. But where it starts to get a little iffy is like, well, if you grab within patches, what are you actually moving? Are you moving your selected loops? Are you moving the visualized patch? Some of those things just get a little tricky to anticipate, what people will expect. And oftentimes it's what we expect and then ends up being what other artists expect is very, very different.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the main challenges of development, for sure.
It is.
There was... I think Johnny just answered it in the chat, but somebody had an issue with interface scaling.
Right. So yeah, that should be fixed at this
tricky
point. Well, fixed, kind of.
Ish.
Yeah.
Yeah, try out the new version and see if it helps.
You would think things like retina scaling for high density monitors, now that they've been out for 10 years or something like that, you would think it would just be second nature, but it's still challenging.
If you get a chance, can you open up your options and show them the UI scaling?
Yes. So as a sort of a workaround for some of the retina issues, we now have underneath general, view options, no, not view options, advanced options?
UI scale at the top?
UI scale.
It's right there, right top. So general UI scale, you can just adjust this as a factor to increase. So for me, I had to set it to a 2x scale for everything to draw normally. Otherwise, it draws at half size. And not a perfect solution, but it works.
And you're working on a smaller screen as well, right? So it makes
sense I'm working
to bump that up.
A 13-inch retina screen.
Which, by the way, is interesting to note that you're working on a pretty high density sculpt and drawing very smoothly on it on a very lightweight laptop.
It probably looks smoother than it is. You're not wrong, although it's much rougher right now only because I'm also screen sharing, and I'm pushing my video card to its limit, mostly with the screen sharing. But yeah, no, it really, particularly in the latest beta, it handles drawing dramatically faster. Performance has always been a challenge for RetopoFlow, just because, again, of everything that's happening under the surface, all the custom mesh drawing that we're having to do. But the beta, which is what I'm running right now, which, by the way, if you are a RetopoFlow customer, then watch your email, because the beta will be going out any time now, ideally right after this stream, but I got a couple of things I have to do before that happens. And yeah, it's dramatically faster now.
Nice. Yeah, when I was using the alpha version earlier today, messing around with it, and then just switched over to the beta right before the stream, and it made a pretty big difference on how smooth it was. It's very snappy.
Good. I'm going to try and pull up another example that'll be a little smaller, just so I can run a little faster while sharing my screen. What is that thing called? It's the shader test. There it is. One thing also, just so that people are aware that we're working on, is at the moment everything in RetopoFlow is done in it has its own key map, and so it's not explicitly what's the word I'm looking for? It doesn't follow your Blender preferences by default. This is something that we are hoping to fix here soon. But at the moment, RetopoFlow has its own key map that you can actually customize via the keymaps.py file that you'll find within the add-on itself. But in the very near future, one of the things that we're trying to do is to actually integrate directly with Blender's key maps, such that, if you set grab to be, J, and you set rotate to be I or whatever, that all of that will just follow, and then that we would have additional RetopoFlow hotkeys that you'd be able to customize directly within the user preferences, just like any other add-on. It's a little involved to do that, but that is the goal. And the main reason I bring that up is simply that I suspect we have a decent number of new people in that are using Blender perhaps for the first time in 2.8. And one of the major defaults that has changed is that left-click select is now default. However, as it exists in the alpha and the beta with RetopoFlow, everything is still right-click select. That will change, but just so you know, that's the current state.
Yeah, I could see that being a little bit confusing for like a totally new user. But it makes sense because that's a very large deal to change, which is why it took so long in the 2.8 to get all the tools working.
And for the most part, using the keymaps.py file that we have, you have the ability to completely customize it, and it'll work just fine. But there are some things that you just have to be aware of that may or may not behave as you expect.
We got a couple more questions.
More fix. Yeah.
Yeah. One of them is from the old Ben. Said, would it be possible to include a U-turn option where you select a U-shaped loop and the outermost face loops get joined into a U-turn? Can be done manually, but it's very hard in RetopoFlow.
I'm not entirely sure I
select
understand the
a
question.
U-shaped loop. Outermost face loops get joined. I feel like if I saw like a visual picture, it would make immediate sense, but I'm having a hard time picturing a U-turn.
Yeah, I mean, you
like
can do
that's what I
like
pictured
this,
as well.
And then fill that. I mean, I would consider that to be a U-turn.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Can you can you clarify that a little bit in the chat? The next question is from Wilco. Is there a way to move part of a loop instead of the whole loop in Loop Tool? In the beta, when I selected part of a loop, it just moved the whole loop when I grabbed the selection.
So what you can do is going into Loop Tool. It's just based on your selection, and so you can either select the entire loop with Control Select or Control Right Mouse in this case, and that'll just basically select the entire loop from one terminating in to the other, and then you hit S and you can slide it. Or you can simply select just the portion that you want to slide, and you can slide that. You can select multiple loops and slide them simultaneously. It basically acts exactly like Blender's default loop slide.
Nice. Yeah, I think that answers the question, because I've been able to slide just part of a loop before, and it seemed to do it. Pixel Mosh Pit says, will the beta go live on Blender Market after the stream?
Yeah, it'll be soon as I get it live. It will be on Blender Market. It will be after the stream. Whether it's 1 hour or 6 hours later remains to be seen. But my goal, actually, originally, until I had technical problems, was to send it out before we started the stream so that everybody could be playing with it right now. That just unfortunately didn't quite happen. But everything's packaged up. It's just a matter of me uploading it to the market and then sending out the email. So if you have a purchase on Blender Market, then watch your email or just check for your downloads here anytime in the next hour or two, and it should be up.
Sweet, that's very soon. Let's see. Do you guys have a percentage of time RetopoFlow saves for game asset developers versus hammer and nails? It does kind of feel like that sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's kind of an impossible question to say for sure, only because it depends entirely on the type of model that you're doing. Just as an example, this little robo orb, if I were retopologizing it completely manually, I could probably do it in a couple of hours. In RetopoFlow, I can do it in when I'm not trying to also talk coherently and screen sharing, I can do it in probably 20 to 30 minutes.
Nice.
I had recently gone to the Blender conference, this last one and the previous one, and I've actually had a few times to sit down with artists in the industry that use it. No, they didn't give me any numbers, although that would be awesome. But again, kind of hard for some things to be able to judge. But it was just nice being able to hear from them how they use RetopoFlow, what sort of changes, not necessarily suggestions, but just kind of like different ways of thinking about different tools. So we're very open to hearing from people that are using it and seeing what it's being used for, how it's being used. There have been a couple of times I've been actually really surprised to see RetopoFlow being used in a way I hadn't even thought of. So
nice.
We would love to hear from.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I'll give you an example of something that is probably going to change based on that user feedback. So in PolyPen right now, every time if you have an edge selected and you hold down Control and then you click, you create you create a triangle, and then you click again and you create a quad. And this is nice. This is how it's always been designed. And my Control key sticks down. This is how it's always been designed to work. But one of the things that came out of a lot of the feedback is that, 90% of the time or so, if you have an edge selected like that, like if I have, say, something like this, and I want to fill this area, most of the time you just want to create an edge, or you want to extrude an edge. So like here, I can click onto the one face, and we can fill a quad. But if I just bring it out into the open like this, it's always going to start as a triangle. Well, realistically though, most of the time you want that to be a quad, and so we're just forcing you to click twice right now, when in reality, the vast majority of the time you could click once if it just created a quad directly and just anticipated the size of the edge to create. So right now, being a triangle, we give you more control, but we're basically forcing you to click more often than you maybe need to. And so that's probably a change that we're going to make, where you'll basically have the option of either extruding quads by default or triangles by default. How exactly that's going to work, we haven't quite figured out, but that's something that we're considering doing.
Nice. I think that could make it a little bit easier. Panboy asks, are there any new major features in 3.0?
John? I don't think so.
No, not yet. In the beta, everything is pretty much exactly same as 2, as RetopoFlow 2.0. It's just running in Blender 2.8.
And it's dramatically faster.
Yeah, the significant amount of work that went into making this happen was actually mostly under the hood. I mean, you can see the UI has changed a little bit, but the way you interact with it, the way that the tools behave, for the most part, we fixed a couple of bugs, but for the most part, it runs exactly the same. So as far as 3.0 beta, no, there's no differences. But
John, do you want to maybe elaborate on what all had to happen for 2.8? Because I think that's probably one of the, not a misconception, but there's not a lot of, I guess, right, clear understanding as far as why 2.8 was such a big project. And frankly, why did it take us so many months to get it done?
Right. So our tool, as we explained, is kind of pushing the boundaries of what they expected for add-ons to typically do. And the way that our tool works in Blender is, so Blender has built into it Python, and inside of it, which is a programming language, and they've added a special module called BPY that allows you to access things within Blender. So you can access anything that you can see in Blender or manipulate, you can actually access and change for the most part through the Python API. It's not just the Blender stuff, but it's also the graphics stuff. I had mentioned that drawing is really tricky to do when you have two surfaces right next to each other. And Blender made a good decision in that they updated the graphics framework that they're running on from a very old version to a newer version. But there were some changes that happened between those two versions that are incompatible. And so a lot of the stuff that we were doing under the hood, the way we were accessing data, manipulating the meshes, adding things into the scene, hiding away the toolbars, those types of things, but also all the ways that you do rendering completely changed. And there was a long time. We actually started working on this back in 2018, late 2018, when 2.8 wasn't even an alpha yet. We made a couple of attempts to kind of start in, but there was just so much that was still changing with the API that we might make a change and then a couple months later have to fix it because Blender core developers, they made another change, and so we'd have to update accordingly. So there was a lot of flux that was happening there. So we kind of waited as long as we could, but because there was so much change between the two versions, 279 and 280, we had to rewrite quite a lot of how RetopoFlow interacts with the system. So a significant amount of time went into just updating the underlying framework. But one nice outcome of it is that rather than pouring those changes only into RetopoFlow, we actually started a side project called Cookie Cutter that we poured all the effort into. The nice thing about it is now that Cookie Cutter can be used across multiple platforms. I'm actually talking with some other developers about creating some tutorials on how to use this. So you may actually see some of the UI, some of the other things show up in other packages. So there was some nice benefit to the community for all this effort. It wasn't just strictly RetopoFlow, but it was a lot of technical effort to get it up and going.
Well, and if I remember right, so we use version control for everything. It's all hosted on GitHub. For any of you that are development savvy, our GitHub repository is public. You are welcome to contribute to it. You're welcome to explore it, and that includes both RetopoFlow and Cookie Cutter. And between the two, not that this necessarily means anything inherently, but just as far as the scope of the changes that were involved, I believe it's something like 19,000 additions to RetopoFlow, or 19,000 removals and another 8,000 additions, and then about the same in equal weight for Cookie Cutter, which is all under the scenes. So even to not change any core functionality, not to introduce any primary new tools, we've got over 20,000 lines of changed code to make it work in 2.8 with the new graphics drawing, and fixing a lot of bugs at the same time.
Yeah, a lot of bugs.
That is wild. That's so much work.
Yeah, it's been I think a much larger project than anybody anticipated it would be.
Right.
I think maybe early on when 2.8 was first coming out, the assumption would be that maybe it'll be a week or two of work. Famous last words there.
Oh man.
So yeah, no, it's been a lot of work, but it's finally there. We've had now 2.8 support for I guess, upwards of a couple of months, I think, just in alpha form.
Right.
And just been slowly fixing that and getting more bug fixes, improving the performance, and trying to make sure it's working on everybody's similar platforms. You know, we've had a few issues, particularly with Mac machines, including my own, with having some pretty significant drawing artifacts where everything just draws in kaleidoscopic colors, and that's always been fun.
Doctor Strange edition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
There's another question from Pinboy. He said, I use RetopoFlow pretty regularly, but one thing I've been missing a lot since version 1.3 is the patches tool. Is there any plan for it to return? But there is a patches tool now, so I don't know, has that changed in functionality over time, or is it different than it used to be?
It has changed a good bit. I think I'm finding a strokes bug. The main thing that's changed is patches used to work fundamentally differently prior to 2.0. So in the 1.x series of RetopoFlow, patches basically worked by kind of like polystrips, where basically you would define a patch of sorts and it would fill a void in your mesh, and then you would be able to continue manipulating that patch strictly as a patch. There wasn't much you could do with it other than basically rotate the infill and things like that. Now patches basically generates everything at one time, so it works a little bit more like things like grid fill. So for example, if I just select this area in patches, so I first control click or control select to select a loop, control shift select another loop and another loop, and these yellow circles that you see here are corners. And so anywhere that we want to mark a corner, we can just hit control shift click, and that creates another corner. As soon as we have 3 or more, it can detect a patch, and in this case it's an L patch that is 11 by 6, so it's 11 sides by 6 sides, and it tries to fill it. Now there's no good way to fill this patch really, so we need to specify another corner. So we might say grab this one here, and now you'll notice that it's saying a bad C patch 7, bad C4, bad C6, and what that means is that the number of sides necessary to fill a patch is not able to find a suitable result. Keeping in mind that we exclusively fill with quads, we don't do any triangles, and we want to extend this a bit so that it could potentially find a result for this, but we have prioritized cleanliness over filling just for filling's sake. There's a lot of mesh solutions that we can do that would allow us to actually fill that automatically with just any all quad result, but any all quad result is not acceptable when you're trying to create good animation friendly geometry. So we prioritize cleanliness over possibilities of sorts. You'll notice that as soon as I deselected that other edge, which then brought this up to 6 and this up to 6, it automatically fills it, and now we have the ability to either adjust it further or to go ahead and just press F and then we fill it. So patches is absolutely still here. It just works quite a bit differently than it used to. Give you another example is we could say have this stroke here, and then I'm going to just draw a stroke down from one vertex to the other just to create an edge profile, something like this. And then I'll adjust my segments, and then in the patches tool, I'll just select those loops, and you can see it automatically tries to fill. Now, we don't have quite enough results here, in part partially because of our other selections, perhaps. So here we have 6, here we have 7, and so if we just go down maybe with our polypen or our polypen tool, we can just insert another vertex there, and that will then enable this to be filled completely. You'll also notice that even though we have additional selections over here that are highlighted, basically it tries to fill each one. And so you can actually get, there we go. It's attempting to fill each of the individual islands as its own patch. Sometimes it'll have overlapping results, so you notice like whenever I deselected this one edge, then this filled correctly. But you just, every now and then you'll have funky results. But for the most part, it works really well to fill large, consistent areas with quads. And then going back with relax here, it's pretty quick to just clean that up.
Nice. Yeah, the follow-up question to that was the old patch tool would let you change the counts of the edges on each side and let you solve that pretty quickly. Is there another way to do that here as well? Maybe like...
No. John, we didn't add that in, did we?
Sorry. Say that again.
Adding in side count adjustments for patches.
So being able to, aside from selection, no. I think I'm wondering if what the question's about is with Patrick's patches implementation that just figured out a good way to fill it. I don't recall if there was a way to actually edit the edges without switching to like Polypen or something like what you had done. Maybe there was, but no. This version of patches, unfortunately, it's a lot simpler. Just to kind of focus more on doing, like exactly what you had mentioned. But that's something that we could possibly take a look at.
But that is definitely like not a easy thing to solve, because in this example here, like you got loops going all the way around the mesh, and to like have the patch change a loop count that manipulates the other side of the object that you're not even looking at could be pretty
a very tricky issue. Yeah, I would say from a workflow standpoint, the previous patches that were a lot more dynamic were also a lot more problematic, at least in my experience, in that they were really cool in theory and that they worked in very good niche cases. But what they didn't really do very good at was adapting to other people's workflows and all sorts of different model environments. And I suspect that's the same issue that most patch solutions will continue to run into, is that it's just a very complicated thing to do in a way that is actually useful at the end of the day to the artist. Every time that I've tried to do it or to test other tools that try to do it, invariably it's one of those that it looks super useful and amazing, and then you try and figure out how to work with it in a workflow, and it's lackluster.
Sure.
I hope that doesn't sound like an excuse, because I don't mean it to be. It's just every time that we've tried to play with patches, like, oh, that would be so cool. Oh, I don't know how to use this.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's one of the challenges of this type of tool, is like it's relatively easy to get something that like looks amazing in like one or two examples, and I don't know, might like sell well, but it doesn't necessarily mean it like works in most scenarios.
Totally.
Omar asks, is there a tool for pinching imperfections in modeling? I mean, correcting them. For example, when modeling a car, its surfaces are always very unforgiving.
I'm not entirely sure I understand the question. I mean, it kind of depends on what you're trying to do. You know, in most cases like that, if you're trying to, say, for example, resolve pinching in a mesh, you're most of the time going to use the relax tool. If you're trying to specifically pinch the mesh in order to basically do a reverse relax, we don't have that. I've always thought it'd be kind of nice to basically allow you to invert the relax and pinch it as opposed to smooth it. We don't have that right now, though.
Just kind of a comment. For feature suggestions like this, or like possibilities, one thing that would be very, very useful is to have some screenshots. So have a screenshot of what the original state was, how you would anticipate interacting with it. So if you're creating a stroke or clicking in a particular spot, highlighting that on the image, and then showing either if we have a similar tool and it's behaving kind of weirdly, show what it actually is doing, but then definitely show what you would expect it to do afterwards. So for this, the pinching, if you're expecting to do like an inverse of a relax or like pulling in instead, it's kind of like a scaling inward sort of a thing, maybe along a line, for example. What would the inputs be that you as an artist would expect to give, and then how do you expect the tool to kind of behave. Ideas like this are really helpful because, like the U-shaped example from before, if we may have some kind of vague idea of it, but we might not have run into that particular scenario that you have, and knowing what goal it is that you're kind of aiming for. So any type of additional information like that would be really, really helpful, either in screenshots or a blend file with like grease pencil marks all over it. Those are excellent ways to be able to communicate new ideas.
Yeah, and there was actually a follow-up screenshot of the U question, U-shaped thing. So I'll throw it up on my screen here. But to be, I think it's just a pole where there's two poles on either side and it just takes a corner. Kind of like where you just take an area and just inset it.
Sure.
And you get those two areas. This is kind of an interesting example because it has like two six-sided poles on either side, and it seems a bit of an odd example, but I think just the idea of like taking a quad and insetting it and getting that curve going around, I think is
well, I mean, right now, no, we don't have it. And I'll show you an example of where it would be really nice, because actually, literally, as I was demoing this, I was like, oh, we need an inset tool. Is this section right here. Let me actually just pop into regular edit mode and show exactly how I would do that in edit mode, and then ideally what the result would become in RetopoFlow. So let me exit. So in this case, I would simply hit extrude, scale it in, and then remove these boundary faces that I didn't intend to create. Like these. Come on. And then if I pop back into RetopoFlow, so this geometry, with the exception of the lingering vertices, is exactly what I would like to create, because now I have this inset face loop that perfectly follows the detail. And without an inset tool, like, yes, I can absolutely do that. It's just pretty tedious to do it with our existing tools. And so that would be an area that a tool like that would be very, very useful. So, and one option I'm going to show real quick is every now and then you may run into issues because of the way that selection is handled in RetopoFlow, where you're like, hey, I just simply can't select this geometry. Well, the reason that you can't select it is because it's literally underneath the surface and it's beyond the clip plane, basically. And so to help fix this, we have an option under General Target Cleaning to snap vertices. So you can just say snap all verts, and it effectively acts like shrink wrap, where it just basically takes all the geometry and snaps it to the closest surface. At least I believe that's what it does, John.
Yes.
And so in this case, it's now solved my selection issues, where now I can just select everything. You won't need that when you're working exclusively in RetopoFlow, but if you do what I just did, where I popped into edit mode, I created some geometry, and I didn't bother to snap it back to the surface, oftentimes that geometry will not be within the clipping window, and you won't be able to select it. We don't really have displaying or anticipating when that'll happen, and so showing that to somebody is a little tricky. But if you ever run into that, well, that's how you fix it.
Nice. That's a great option to have, and it's definitely a lot faster than applying shrink wrap multiple times.
Yeah.
I think the last question that we have here is from Panboy. More of a comment than a question, but he said, I've never used cookie cutter, but I just got hard op, so I'm not sure if I need it. And I think that's a little bit of a misunderstanding in that cookie cutter is meant for developers of other add-ons.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
That is correct. So maybe just to reiterate on that point, so cookie cutter is basically the development library that powers a lot of the underlying functionality, such as the interface drawing, the mesh visualization, etc. And it's just basically a set of frameworks that John has written that then works hand in hand with RetopoFlow. So Cookie Cutter can be continually developed on its own to power these kinds of UI options, the mesh drawing, etc. And then RetopoFlow can pull those in and work with them, such that most of that framework is handled outside of RetopoFlow directly. And the main reason for that is it enables all of those frameworks to be reused by other developers. So there's a few other add-ons out there right now. I don't remember immediately offhand the names of them, but that are using the same cookie framework to do a lot of the same stuff that RetopoFlow is doing in terms of the interface.
Nice. That's definitely really helpful. You've done so much heavy lifting already that makes it easier for other developers.
Hopefully.
That's the goal.
That's the goal.
Nice. I think we've gone through pretty much everything. Is there anything else that you wanted to demo or talk about in terms of RetopoFlow or the new version, or where you see it going?
One thing that I'll just talk about as far as long-term plans, right now where it's at, RetopoFlow it's basically full-featured in that you can do everything. Some things like, for example, the inset example can be a little slower, so there's going to be more tools that we would like to add that enable more of that kind of functionality. Just basically more power tools. But at this point in time, you can retopologize an entire model from start to finish in RetopoFlow, which was always one of our key goals. And so some of our next stages are basically just making it more user-friendly, better enabling you to work natively within Blender. Particularly with 2.8, there's a lot of basically open questions as to where does RetopoFlow continue to exist as a mode. So for example, it's theoretical that RetopoFlow may eventually just work within the native tool system in Blender so that it wouldn't start its own UI. Whether or not that'll happen, we don't know. A lot of it is dictated by what we can technically do, and then a lot of it is also personal preference, and just whether or not it's practical to do, basically. For example, if we moved RetopoFlow into a native tool such that it wasn't doing custom mesh drawing or anything like that, would we still be able to maintain the high fidelity mesh visualization that we have now that draws over your existing surfaces? Maybe not. And if we can't, that's a deal breaker. If we can, cool. We've got options to look at. And so where it continues to exist as its own mode inside of Blender is unknown, but we're definitely looking at stuff like that. As it exists right now, RetopoFlow is effectively its own software that just happens to run inside of Blender, for better and for worse.
Yeah, and I think, just based on what I've seen so far, looks like it'll be definitely more interesting things coming down the road.
Hopefully.
So people can, if they've already purchased RetopoFlow, they can get the beta version fairly soon, or if they want to get the alpha version right now, they already can.
Yep.
And any idea on when the official 3.0 will be out and available?
John?
We need lots of testers. So jump on in, try it out, let us know what works. If you run into any problems, you can report an issue. There's a button right there on the main panel there, the RetopoFlow
Right
window. But also, if something happens under the hood, RetopoFlow should catch it, and it'll show up a big red box. Don't just dismiss it and close it right away. Let us know. The more information you can give us about what happened, the easier it is for us to be able to fix it. But really, at this point, it's fairly. I've been using it. I'm not an artist, but I've been trying to break it in every way that I can. And I know that Jonathan has been using it and trying to break it in every way he can. But we can't hit everything. But if you're out there, try it out. Let us know. Really, it's just kind of making it as robust as possible. Beyond that, I don't know. Depends on how many issues we have. If there appears to be no issues, it'll probably be sooner than if we run into hundreds of issues.
Right.
That makes sense, and it's better to have a nice stable release than one that happens immediately that breaks.
Agreed.
Nice.
Can I have you, Jonathan, do one thing real quick?
Yep.
So it did exist in the past, versions of RetopoFlow, but we're trying to flesh it out a little bit more, at least for right now. But there is a nicer way of being able to get help. So if you could show them the help window real quick.
Oh, the fancy one.
There are different help documents. One of them is the main welcome. So whenever you start up RetopoFlow, you should be greeted with this message. It's just a little note from us. One quick note in this version, the images are still from the older version of RetopoFlow. We're still in the process of updating them. But it provides some information letting you know what's new. But there is a table of contents. And from this, you can go to any of the tools or access kind of general RetopoFlow help. So if you have questions about how do I use PolyPen, what is that keyboard shortcut, you can go here or press F2 on your keyboard, and it'll pop up whichever tool you currently have selected. It'll bring up the information for that tool. And then for more general things, there's the general RetopoFlow help, and it has stuff that should apply across all of the tools. So there are quick keyboard shortcuts for switching between the tools. Hitting G does a grab and move, just like in Blender. Control S goes to save, all that good stuff. So anything you see that's underlined is clickable, and either it loads up a new document like this, or sometimes it'll be a web page, and it'll open up whatever your default web browser is and go to that page. But this is a great point of information. So we don't have help documents online. But instead, we're trying to put everything through here, so you have quick access to it whenever you need it.
Nice. There's definitely a few times when I was just starting out playing with the tools and had to remember oh, what does this do, and then just quickly jumping in the help with pictures and everything made it super easy.
Great.
Nice. Well, thank you guys for your time and for checking this out. That's super exciting. One of the oldest Blender add-ons that there is, and it's still being updated and still being used, and still continues to push onward. Is super cool to see.
It's weird to think that it's